It had been almost 40 years that the Israelites were wandering around in the desert, in the wilderness. And remember, these thousands of people had left Egypt as slaves, and it didn't really take 40 years. It wasn't like it was that far. They could have been in the new land long before. But why weren't they in that land that Moses had promised them, that God had promised? Because they wouldn't obey God. Now remember when some of the people worshipped that golden calf? And God told them only worship him. Well, they disobeyed then. They worshiped that idol instead. Remember when Moses wanted them to trust God and go into the new land, but they were afraid because there were giants? They didn't trust that God would give them the strength to get through there, to win the land. And so once again, their lack of faith and trust in God, they were disobeying God. And they forgot about how they disobeyed, though. And they didn't learn from their mistakes. You know, it's okay to make mistakes, and God does forgive sin. But when we keep doing the same mistakes over and over again, that's when there's consequences. And God did not allow them to go into that promised land because they didn't have faith and they were continually disobeying him. Well, so they were now traveling through the desert. And once again, as they were traveling, they were hot and thirsty, and they were dusty, and they were starting to murmur. They were tired of walking, tired of traveling, and they were thirsty. Remember, many years before, they were thirsty, and did God provide water for them? Yes. And instead of asking God and praying and saying, Lord, we need water to drink, please guide us to the water, instead, they grumbled and complained. So they started complaining to Moses again. And they came to him and they said, Moses, why did you take us out of Egypt so that we can go be thirsty and starving to death? And they were just so frustrated. And they started shouting. The people just started shouting, water, water, we want water. And they were complaining. And they thought, somebody said, why did we leave Egypt? We should have just stayed there. Moses, why did you bring us? Was it to get rid of us? Was it so that we would die? Of course not. And several of them were saying, where is this land you promised us? They were supposed to grow fig trees and pomegranates and giant fruit. They forgot. It was their unbelief that prevented them to going in there, right? Well, Moses and Aaron left that crowd and they went to the tabernacle to pray. They knew what to do. Anytime we have trouble, we should pray. And that's what Moses and Aaron did. And they got on their knees and they prayed and they said, Lord, we're thirsty. What can we do? Please guide us. And so God said, I want you to get Aaron's rod and gather the people together at the rock that I'm telling you to go to. And I want you to speak to the rock and tell the rock to pour out water. God wanted Moses to use words and speak to the rock. Oh my goodness, that's amazing. And he said, show them that my power will take care of them. This is what my power can do. And Moses and Aaron wondered, how could this happen? But do you think they had faith? They had faith. They've seen God do miracles. But God continued and he said, I will give them water from the rock, enough for the people and enough for their cattle. So now remember, God said, get Moses' rod. But what did he say to do with the rod? Well, he just said, gather the people. He didn't actually say that Moses should necessarily do anything with the rod. But he called all the people, and they all went to this mountain, and they gathered around to see what would happen and if God would provide the water. But you know what? Moses was quite angry with the people because of their grumbling and complaining. And God told Moses to speak to the rock. But instead of speaking to the rock, in his anger, he took his rod, Aaron's rod, and he pounded the rock. And he started kind of shouting at the people, and he was angry. And he said, listen, you rebels, do we have to bring water from this rock? You're always complaining. And he was so angry that he didn't remember what God told him. God said to speak to the rock, not strike it with his rod. And instead of speaking to it, he struck that rock as hard as he could, not once, but twice. But guess what? God still blessed, and God allowed water to gush out from that rock, and water came pouring out, and the people were able to get down to the water, and oh, they took drinks, and they were so happy, and it was so delicious, and it was wonderful. And even though Moses didn't quite do it exactly how God wanted to, or God told him to, but God did promise, and he kept his promise, as God always does, and there was the water. He brought that water, and the people drank their fill. But you know, God was disappointed in Moses that he didn't obey all the way. Moses obeyed part of the way. He brought the people to the rock, and he brought his rod. But instead of obeying all the way with a good attitude, he got angry. And because of his frustration and anger, he hit that rock. And God had told Moses just to speak to the rock. And what did God do about this? It's kind of a little bit sad. Listen to what he said. Because you did not do as I told you, and you disobeyed me in front of these people, you shall not bring these people into the land I promised them. Moses wasn't going to get to go into the land. Oh my goodness. Remember all of those people for 40 years, the older people that went with Moses, they didn't get to go. Little by little, they died off, but their children were going to get to go in. But Aaron was going to get to go in, and Joshua. Remember Joshua and Caleb, because they had faith in God. Oh my goodness. Moses must have wept many tears, thinking, if only I had obeyed God. But Moses trusted God, and he understood God's law is important. And so he knew that he deserved a consequence for his disobedience. Adam and Eve had learned that difficult lesson in the Garden of Eden, remember? They had to leave the garden. And even though Moses had obeyed many times before, God wanted him to always obey. He had to be the example to the people. And he was not supposed to be lashing out in anger, but trusting God and doing just exactly what God said. So do you think that made Moses mad and he said, that's it, I quit. I'm not going to obey God or serve him anymore? No, he didn't do that. He knew he had done wrong, but he kept loving God and serving God. And Moses knew that God was fair, but he has to be righteous, and he is the judge. So he trusted God and his punishment, and he accepted his punishment without complaint. He was always a good leader, most of the time. Of course, this one time when he got angry and pounded the rock, that wasn't a good example, and that's why God needed to give him a consequence. But Moses wanted to be a good leader, and he wanted to be a good example. So he accepted that punishment from God. And we'll find out what happens to Moses next.